Welcome to a new Historic Autographs video series. The Historic Autographs Company is but one of many companies, from big auction houses to independent traders, that collect and deal in historic items. For many collectors, there's a certain thrill in holding a piece of history, something that admittedly doesn't translate to anything you can do on YouTube. So we've got something a little different here. Instead of just making a biographical video essay of a story you've heard before and pitching your cards at the end, this video will cover the life of George Washington, as well as the circumstances revolving around historical relics and treasures he left behind. Some you can buy, some you can visit, and some you can hold. Without further ado, this is George Washington, A Material History. Nowadays, George Washington's estate is managed by a third party simply known as Mount Vernon, overseen by the private and non-profit Mount Vernon Ladies Association of the Union. They have an expansive collection of Washington's material possessions, they keep and maintain the Mount Vernon estate as a historical site, and they are also a source of a great deal of Washington relics on the market today, including some of Historic Autographs products. The link to the website is in the description. It's super organized and was really helpful in putting this video together. Washington was born in 1732 to Augustine and Mary Washington. He had 4 half-siblings from his father's previous marriage, and they all grew up outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia, in a farm that George would inherit 11 years later. Mount Vernon went to his half-brother. Being the son of a lower court officer, a young George Washington received an education and picked up the handy trade of land surveying, appraising and mapping land for selling, a job which he practiced for several years, making money and purchasing a decent amount of land for himself. He would have used a surveying compass similar to this one in Mount Vernon's collection. When his half-brother died in 1752, he leased Mount Vernon from his half-brother's family. Washington's half-brother's name was Lawrence Washington, and he served in the Virginia militia. Following Lawrence's death, at the ripe old age of 20, George Washington joined the Virginia militia himself. Robert Dinwiddie, the lieutenant governor, brought Washington on as a major right away, placing Washington in command. And in 1753, Washington was sent to deliver a message from the British to the French to vacate British-claimed land. He was to gather information on their forces while he was at it. While the French didn't leave, Washington returned alive, which was a good start to his military career. And so Washington, right before the start of the French and Indian War, was promoted to lieutenant colonel, second in command of the Virginia Regiment. He led an attack against a French military camp, resulting in the death of a French commander carrying a diplomatic message. Then things got chaotic. Washington's commander died, leaving Washington in charge, but then his regiment merged with one led by James Mackay, who had seniority, so it wasn't clear who should be in charge. But that wouldn't matter, because shortly after, Washington's forces were overwhelmed in a French attack in retaliation for Washington attacking that camp. And the surrender document Washington signed included a clause which placed the death of that one French commander I mentioned earlier on Washington's shoulders as an assassination. But that could have been a trick, because Washington claimed that the translator did not communicate that clause properly, and wouldn't you know it, that entire thing, the Jumonville affair, just kicked off the French and Indian War. The militia was restructured, and Washington ended up stepping down rather than accepting a demotion. He wasn't done fighting, though. He volunteered as an aide to Major General Edward Braddock in 1755, wearing this small sword while he faced a crushing defeat at Monongahela. Braddock died in the fight, and Washington was appointed colonel, though immediately faced more clashes over seniority and authority with other commanders, and he resigned. In 1759, Washington, now at home, married Martha Dandridge Custis, a widow, and they moved into Mount Vernon. In 1761, Lawrence's widow Anne died, leaving the newlywed Washingtons the owners. George Washington was already considerably wealthy, being the owner of a substantial amount of land. Sidebar, Historic Autographs sells some of that land, quite literally. Founding Fathers, releasing in 2025, will include cards containing a spoonful of dirt pulled from the land near the Mount Vernon estate that Washington once owned, as well as dirt from important historical locations and battlefield sites. Anyway, Martha's family and former marriage also made her considerably wealthy, and her dowry, combined with George's wealth, made him one of the richest men in Virginia, owning quite a lot of land and well over 100 slaves. He had quite the stable situation, to say in the least. He held parties, and he ran for legislature, joining the House of Burgesses in 1758. He wasn't noted to be very active in that group for several years, until he and other elites started to become increasingly dissatisfied with British taxation policy. He became more politically active, and when war broke out in 1775, he joined the Second Continental Congress and was nominated and elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, thanks to his combat and tactical experience. Washington was sent to rally the militia and take command of the Siege of Boston. His new position came with prestige, a reputation that preceded him on his journey to Boston, and a number of material perks in Mount Vernon's archive, like this folding 4-poster bed, and a number of trunks, canteens, and whatnot. Yeah, that's a camp bed. That's a little different than what we've got today. A play-by-play of the Revolutionary War would be a lot to get into, but rest assured it's teeming with history at every step. I'll give you the fast version. Washington succeeds at Boston, loses at New York, retreats west into the winter, and crosses the Delaware River so well it gets painted several times. There's a bunch of battles with bad odds for Washington. Morale is low, the critics are having a field day. Valley Forge is so freaking cold, you guys, but then things are looking grim, and Washington manages to pry some better supplies out of Congress, and his troops trained over the winter, and now the French are here, and while they don't rap nearly as much as Hamilton would lead you to believe, they do help Washington flip the war on its head and the British surrender following the Siege of Yorktown. Following the war and America's independence, Washington returned home and rested for a bit while remodeling Mount Vernon and finding ways to make the land profitable again, because the very new quote-unquote government wasn't in a position to pay him very much yet. He didn't get much time to work, though, before the Constitutional Convention in 1787. You see, while he was at home, America was struggling to hold together, and the Articles of the Confederation weren't cutting it, so he gets called in to preside over a convention. The end result of which is the Constitution. And it isn't long after that George Washington is elected the first president of the United States, inaugurated in 1789. Washington's presidency was just as busy and hectic as you'd expect the first presidency of a new nation to be. He had to make decisions about Native Americans, slavery, the French and the British, the banks, power, money, land, you name it. The fact alone that the United States, a budding democratic republic that had already seen an internal rebellion, survived its first presidency speaks to Washington's capability as a leader. It's not hard to see why Washington is a figure that history venerates so readily, and being so venerated, it's natural that the things he touched turned to gold, both in the sense that people pay a lot to come into contact with his legacy, and that he became the very example of what this country finds valuable. Despite that, it's hard to find significant material history from this era. He had a wardrobe, he definitely had personal affects from his time as president. It's a lot of dishware, but it doesn't carry the same gravitas as a sword or a flintlock. The tangibility of this stage of Washington's legacy comes in the form of documents. Collectors nowadays gravitate to the signatures on those documents, but Historic Autographs has an additional approach in the form of written word cards. We make cards not just with Washington's signatures, but also his actual handwriting pulled from smaller, inconsequential, or damaged documents. And in terms of things turning to gold, there's a prime example in the Dudley Gatewood House, a historical site that was a home in which Washington slept while touring the South in 1791. That house was torn down in 2024 as it had fallen into disrepair, but the pieces of that house turned into collector's items. So you can bet Historic Autographs was there. And now, in our product, are nails from a home Washington once stayed in. After his presidency, Washington stayed somewhat politically active, but mostly as a voice of advice and experience. He resumed trying to make his land profitable, which proved difficult. He built a distillery and made whiskey, which is also a collector's item. Mount Vernon still produces and sells whiskey to this day. Ultimately, though, he wouldn't reach the wealth he saw before the Revolution, but that's not to say he wasn't comfortable. His personal care of the estate continued until December 1799, when, at the age of 67, Washington came down with an upper respiratory infection and passed away. It's difficult to summarize the effect George Washington had on history. He got a lot done, much of it with profound and far-reaching consequences. It admittedly feels inherently difficult to handle the legacy of this human being who has been so mythologized. And that's where, I think, the magic of collecting is found. George Washington was a person, and Washington left behind a lot of stuff. Hair, medals, furniture, signatures that you, a person, can hold, just like he did centuries ago. And for a second, the distance between some person in 2024 and some person who built a nation 200 years ago can be surprisingly small. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Historic Autograph's Material History. If you liked it, consider liking, commenting, or subscribing so we know what to make more of. And if you like history and/or collecting as much as we do, check out our upcoming Founding Fathers product for Washington-themed art cards, signatures, hair cards, dirt cards, nails, and more. Thanks again, and have a nice day.